today we're doing our first in an ongoing series of Star Wars ripoffs. The cultural impact and box office success of Star Wars spawned numerous imitations and homages from all over the world, which is only fitting since Star Wars itself was a pastiche of genres, stories, and conventions from all over the world. And we have genuine affection for a lot of these movies and wanted to take this opportunity to discuss some of our favorites. The first film we're going to talk about is perhaps the most infamous, The Man Who Saves the World, better known online as Turkish Star Wars. And appearances aside, this movie is much more than a mere ripoff, and to help explain why, we are very excited to be joined by our special guests, award-winning filmmaker and film historian, author of How the World Remade Hollywood: Global Interpretations of 65 Iconic Films, and aside from the filmmakers themselves, arguably the foremost expert on The Man Who Saves the World. I'm so pleased to welcome Ed Glazer to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've been looking forward to this episode for a while. So, Ed, you're a film historian, and your primary focus is what you call cross-cultural remakes. Is that correct?
I usually call them remake exploitation because it's more fun. Cross-cultural remakes is probably something that is maybe more acceptable in academic spheres.
Yeah, I think remake exploitation's a much more fun term for the phenomenon. And if you wouldn't mind, just to start out, for the benefit of our listeners who may not have any idea what we're talking about, how would you define remake exploitation as a phenomenon? Like, what do you consider a remake exploitation film?
More often than not, it tends to be a film that capitalizes on the success of a previous film in one way or another, by sort of doing a lot of the main things that that original film did again, often doing sort of an unauthorized remake. So there's a lot of sort of in quotes rip-off kind of material that tends to fall into the remake exploitation genre. Now, I would contend that there's a lot of official remakes that sort of do that, but all of these take place in other countries. So countries outside of the movie's initial production country.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, we're talking about Western films, by and large, from the US that have either made a lot of money or have a large cultural footprint. And what's so interesting about this specific phenomenon that you talk about is that like it's not just a cash in to make a lot of money. I mean, obviously it's that, but it's also the fascinating ones are the ones that manage to inject the culture that's remaking it into the work that it's remaking. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the sort of secret implicit part of remake exploitation. The idea is sort of it's remake exploitation. So you're exploiting that original film. You're doing that in another country for another audience, with different pop culture touchstones, different social, religious, etc. backgrounds. So you are tailoring your remake or remix to that new audience, and so it has to incorporate it has to incorporate new ideas. Sometimes those are greater, and sometimes those are less, just depending on what the filmmaker is kind of trying to achieve. And you get some remakes that are kind of very by the numbers cash-ins, but I think you also have a lot of remakes that are less slavish remakes and more an opportunity for artists to kind of express themselves through that remake.
No, absolutely. And I would argue that the film we're going to be discussing in a few minutes is a really good example of that, because it's not at all a remake of Star Wars. It's doing its own thing. Its very own thing. It's and it is interesting too, this phenomenon, because a lot of countries have their own film industries that are sort of shaped by the economic and social and political situations that are unique to them, and that very often comes out in the films that they put out. I think our listeners are probably, familiar with, like, the spaghetti western, for example, is like a whole subgenre of the western that comes from Italy in the 1960s. And there are a lot of trends, like especially in the Italian film industry, which is the sort of example of remake exploitation, as you term it, that I'm the most familiar with. But like there are trends that they would follow. So you get like a zillion what they called like sword and sandal films, and then you get the Western films and then the crime films and
Right.
stuff.
The Italians even have a particular name for that phenomenon. They're called filoni, which is the Italian word for thread. It's the idea that one particular film starts this whole thread of similar films.
Oh, that's
Oh, wow.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say, because it's a Star Wars podcast, but Dave Filoni is the sort of like head honcho over at Disney Star Wars with all of the new shows. He's like the major creative voice or one of the major creative voices. So, I mean, that's what that word made me think of.
That's funny.
So, what's interesting is that Star Wars happens and creates its own Filoni.
Hmm.
It seems very appropriate to me that a film that already has remixing in its DNA would sort of spawn a whole subgenre of people using it as a jumping off point to create their own work.
Absolutely.
What do you find so compelling about these remix exploitation films? Obviously, I mean, you wrote a book about them. You did a whole very awesome YouTube series called Deja Vu that's on your Neon Harbor YouTube channel. What is it about them that deserves so much attention?
For me personally, I've just always had a particular fascination with remakes in general. It just sort of tickles that part of my brain where I want to connect dots and compare and understand reasonings behind things. One of my favorite films is a remake of a film. It's the John McTiernan remake of the Thomas Crown Affair. I thought the original is fine, but I loved McTiernan's film. It's fantastic. And then very shortly thereafter, McTiernan remade another film by the same director that was Rollerball, and that movie's terrible. And I started like hunting down like why is this movie so bad? What changed? What is the reason behind this? I feel like there should be a pattern here for it, good remake of a guy's film to another good remake of this guy's film. But I've always been interested in remakes. I just think that they're generally interesting, and I think a number of artists also seem to think so. I mean, you look at, for example, Mozart, who did the 12 variations on Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, just because it was just interesting. And the thing is that we're very familiar with remakes from our own culture to the point where we complain about them all the time. Um, but seeing our culture, our pop culture, through a very different lens really kind of takes that interest for me to the next level, to see what is it that resonates overseas. Um, what are the ways that our stories are adapted? That's just all really cool and neat, and I want to sink my teeth into it. So uh, I don't know that there's really a concrete answer. I just think uh, I feel like it tells us something about ourselves, about other cultures, and if you're kind of a pop culture historian, as many of us kind of are these days, uh, it's just a really fun kind of playground to explore.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book, cross-cultural remix are basically like perfect examples of memes, which I thought was very true. Like you can't get a cleaner example of like a piece of cultural information kind of passing from one entity to another.
Absolutely. And my friend and colleague Ian Robert Smith wrote another book on the subject, more academic work on the subject called The Hollywood Meme, which explores that idea in even greater detail.
This is something as Westerners or as Americans that we forget that the film industry, such as it is, because of the amount of money involved in, mounting a film and distributing a film, certainly historically, like Hollywood and American films have really sort of had this hegemonic grip on the world. So in a certain sense, it's like countries in the world had no choice but to sort of see American films and, watch American films. And it seems to me it's only natural that they would take those examples and adapt them to fit their sensibilities and how they see the world, and they want to see a reflection of their values and faces that they recognize. I think in your chapter on The Man Who Saves the World, you say something about how that was the first time that children had seen a Turkish man in space.
Hmm.
Yeah, that alone makes its existence worthwhile.
I should add for the particularly pedantic out there that obviously it was not the first Turkish science fiction film. There have been other films with Turks in space, but it was really sort of the first Turkish astronaut. You know, the idea that this is a character who isn't um, sort of brought into space by happenstance. He isn't a an alternate version of a pop culture character from elsewhere that we're already aware of. For example, Star Trek. There was a Turkish Star
Oh,
Trek
I see.
film,
Yes.
but you know
Right.
these were Turkish sort of astronauts or sort of space heroes in their own right.
No, absolutely. And we welcome the pedantic in all its forms on this podcast. So, The Man Who Saves the World. Do you remember the first time you came across this film?
You bet I do. It's not especially exciting, but it is sort of burned into my memory. It was I had recently shown some friends an unsubtitled copy of a Bollywood remake of Silence of the Lambs. So yes, a Silence of the Lambs musical, and that was a great deal of fun. They enjoyed that a lot, and I started thinking, you know, I wonder if there are other international remakes, possibly unauthorized, that are out there. So I should look. I should look online and just see what I can find. And I think I just Googled the foreign remakes or something, foreign movie remakes, foreign movie ripoffs, you know, whatever my uh, Google foo sort of suggested to me at the time. And the first thing that came up was the Turkish Star Wars. And I think I was taken to somebody's review of the film, some written review of the film, and I'm like, this looks amazing. I think there were some screenshots, it looked amazing. This was in the very earliest days of YouTube. So we're talking about an era where videos were generally capped at 5 or 10 minutes. Um, but the complete film was available on Google Video back when that was a thing. So this was before Google even bought out YouTube. And so I remember telling my friends about this, and we all gathered in the basement of one of my friends' houses. And he got Google Video up and running on his computer and then like ran the computer output to a CRT TV so that we could all watch it more comfortably. And like then you know that when you do that, the film is or the video is even blurrier because you're not talking about a one-to-one sort of pixel aspect ratio. So it's kind of compensating and everything looks a little bit fuzzier than it should. So we all gathered around the TV watching this very poorly subtitled, rather blurry, uh, wild Turkish science fiction film with several boxes of pizza, uh, trying to figure out what was going on, and it was magic. And from then on, I knew I had to find more of this stuff. And I think perhaps more importantly, I kind of had to figure out and learn where did this come from. I mean, yes, Turkey, but why this film? Why does it look like this? Why does it sound like this? Who are the people that made it? What was the context surrounding it? Because I think it's very easy to look at a weird film out of context that we kind of don't understand, and it's entertaining, but um, you know, people made it. So how did they make it? Why did they make it? Why did they make this? That sort of thing. So there you go.
No, totally. I think you hit the nail on the head. I have certainly found I have a much greater appreciation for all kinds of films when I have at least some of the context, especially for foreign films or older films that may come from a culture, a tradition, a sensibility that I don't bring with me. So I have a much richer viewing experience of a movie when I have some familiarity with the cultural context of from which it sprang. I don't know why I said it like that. So that said, could you talk a little about what you discovered about where The Man Who Saves the World, aka Turkish Star Wars, came from?
Yeah. The year was 1982, and there was a filmmaker named Chetin Inanç, um, and his producing partner, Mehmet Karafaz, and they'd been in business for a number of years. And the history of Turkish cinema is a wild one and would take too long to go into. But basically, the idea is that it was a country with a ravenous appetite for films, no real infrastructure to make films, no sort of Hollywood or Cinecittà or, um, the Shaw Brothers in Hong Kong. Like there's just nothing like that. So it was all very fly by the seat of your pants, very, very low budget. And in 1982, they had a multi-picture deal with a very famous Turkish action star named Cüneyt Arkın. And they had done a number of sort of cops and robbers films, um, but they were kind of looking for something different. The problem was that this was just a couple of years after Turkey's third military coup in about 30 years. And so there was a very big issue with censorship. So one's options as an artist for creating art is very limited when you're under martial law. So you cannot do a film with a lot of political subject matter. And even if you don't, there's still a possibility that you will be censored anyway. There are filmmakers who complained that they had a scene on a beach, a romantic scene on the beach, and one of the two lovers says, uh, "Come on in, the water's shallow over here," and that was censored because it gave away strategic information about the coast of Turkey.
Wow.
No,
You would have this story is sort of a is not strictly true, but there are stories like this that you would have bad guys shooting at a car, and it would shoot out the left tire, and the censor would say, "Why did he shoot the left tire? Are you a leftist?" And so, I mean, they were kind of looking for reasons to just use their scissors. Um, but the point is that it was very difficult to make whatever kind of films you wanted to. You generally had to play it safe. Um, However, Chetin Inanç was looking for something different, and around this time, The Empire Strikes Back was in cinemas, and he thought, the space adventure stuff. Cüneyt Arkın was hugely famous for a lot of swashbuckling, sword fight adventure films in the Errol Flynn mode in the 70s. What if we do something like that, but in space? Effectively, kind of a Flash Gordon sort of deal. Well, Cüneyt Arkın was down for it. So they went to Inanç's partner, Mehmet Karafaz, pitched their idea, and Karafaz was, I guess, in a very uh, good mood because he was willing to give them twice the usual budget that he would normally give to a film, which, I mean, to a certain extent is understandable because space adventure films are very expensive, much more expensive than, say, melodramas or cop movies or things like that. That still only amounted to about $300,000, which is about 1/37th the cost of Star Wars. It's less than 2% the cost of The Empire Strikes Back. So uh still they decide that they want to go forward with this. And Inanç's idea is to build a bunch of outdoor spaceship sets uh in this sandy seaside resort town of Kilios. And they create these sort of cool spaceship sets for all of the outer space scenes. And I'm not sure exactly how they were planning on shooting it, but unfortunately, it doesn't really matter because just before they were going to shoot, a storm hit and destroyed the sets. So now they were left with no spaceships for their space movie, and had to figure out how to, I mean, at the very least, how to get them onto this Flash Gordon Mongo style planet where they have to fight the monsters and save the girl and defeat the bad guy. So Inanch does the only thing he can do. He steals Star Wars. Uh, he bribes a night watchman, and overnight he steals the reels from Star Wars Episode 4. Um, Overnight, takes them to his editor friend and colleague Kunt Tolgar's studio. They take the scenes that they want, the space footage, the dogfight stuff, mostly the trench sequence, um, make uh, duplicates of those sequences, and then get the reels back to the studio before the next day. And with that, they cobble together this new space sequence that kicks off the film. Now, early accounts of the film suggest that the beginning of the movie was really intended to be sort of a Planet of the Apes kind of thing, where the heroes were
Oh,
really sort of scientific astronauts, and then they end up crashing on the planet, which, if you watch the film and you see right after they do crash, there's this sort of exploratory sequence that both looks and sounds, thanks to lifted music, very much like Planet of the Apes.
I was
Um,
Yes.
gonna
Yeah.
say, yes, it does.
and so my guess, I'm not 100% sure about this, but my educated guess is that what happened was that Star Wars was the most sensible movie to get space footage from. There's only a certain kind of space footage in Star Wars, what with the wars and all. So they basically recrafted the opening sequence to be about a space battle, and shot new material to incorporate that. And so they're using sequences with the Death Star trench run, and then to show their heroes as pilots of some of these fighters, they sit them down in the dubbing studio, project footage from Star Wars behind them, and give them motorcycle helmets and uh, I think headphones on top of the motorcycle helmet, and then have them talk about, okay, I'm ascending. All right, Typhoon 2, let's go. And behind them is space footage from Star Wars, but with the cuts, so that
Right.
suddenly they're like, at one point there's like another TIE fighter behind them, and then suddenly they're careening backwards down the Death Star. It's like, it's absolutely bonkers. Um, so that ended up giving Turkish Star Wars its most famous scene. But really, the rest of the film is kind of uh, a Flash Gordon style adventure meets scatterbrained religious allegory, with footage from multiple movies and music from even more movies.
No, well, that actually makes a lot of sense that the Star Wars sequence at the beginning was created out of necessity, but there's like sort of a charming quality to that opening sequence, the idea that they thought they could get away with this. Like the belief that they had in what they were doing was so strong that they just knew that you would go with it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, it's not quite a case of sort of Ed Woodian optimism, uh, but, the fact that it it was a very kind of slapdash industry, and uh, I think because of that, and I don't mean like it's bad, I just mean like everything had to be kind of thrown together very quickly all the time to keep churning out these
Yes.
movies because, I mean, at its peak, uh, Turkey's film industry was the third most prolific in the world. So you're doing that with no,
Oh, I didn't realize
yeah.
that.
So you're doing that with no infrastructure. I mean, like, come on. Um, and so audiences were, I think, very willing to go along with it. And the thing is that, people will say, people in America or generally in the West will look at something like Turkish Star Wars and say, like, oh, I can't believe that they, did they not like know that it was from Star Wars? Did they not have Star Wars? It's like, no, of course they knew it was from Star Wars. the things that didn't matter. Like you're you're you're getting the idea across. There's fun space battles. What's not to like? And there
Yeah.
really wasn't anything that was legally preventing them from doing what they were doing, because Turkey's intellectual property laws were very nebulous when it came to um, foreign intellectual property.
Yeah, film certainly now, but for I think the last few decades, I feel like has had a preoccupation with realism. By that I mean the audience assumes that what they are being shown is what literally is supposed to be happening.
Zero suspension of disbelief.
Right, right. And I feel like that's not always the way films used to operate with an audience. Like I feel like there was sort of like this implicit understanding that films could also be more representational.
Hmm.
The images and the cinema of it all is like creating an impression that's supposed to communicate an idea. And I think the opening sequence of this film is an example where I think you're right. I think, like, to contemporary Western eyes, like, they aren't seeing the representation. We sort of lost the ability to see what it's doing, which is creating an impression, a representation of what this is supposed to be. It's not literally this is happening. You're supposed to believe this is real and exactly what it is, right? If that makes any
Yep,
sense.
absolutely. And again, it's worth remembering that this was not Plan A, but they
Right.
did have to finish a
Yeah.
film. So
Yes.
To go back to like the political climate it was made in, like as I understand, like Janaid Arkin, like he made actual like overtly political, like a few overtly political movies in the '70s, kind of right before the martial law era. And I was wondering if you've ever sensed that like this is a secretly like political movie in any way, in the sense that for Star Wars is. Um,
No.
Even though that, despite, yeah, that, I mean, that's what they were. That's what they were trying to avoid, that appearance at all costs. But I wonder if that kind of snuck in there
No, I mean,
in any way.
to be sure, there were political filmmakers that were still doing their best around that time. I mean, in 1980, you had directors like Yilmaz Güney, very famous left-wing Marxist filmmaker, who, in the year of, or just after the coup, made The Road, Yol, from prison, by proxy. So there were still political filmmakers, but in the case of Turkish Star Wars, it really was made explicitly for children.
There were some things in there that I couldn't help but wonder if there was some maybe unconscious political message, like some stuff in there about Turkish pride, or maybe the idea that their culture would survive into the future.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fair. I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that Turkey is and has been a very nationalistic country. So there really is a lot of that throughout the sort of pop culture. I worked on an English language translation of a Turkish version of Dracula from the 1920s, and it was basically a pirated version of Dracula. The real Bram Stoker's novel didn't get into Turkey until the 1990s or 1990, something like that. And one of the things that it did, besides modernizing it and setting it in Istanbul, is really infusing it with that very familiar sense of Turkish nationalism that you would see in something like Turkish Star Wars, or many of the films of that era. So I would say, sort of like you're saying, it's not uncommon for that audience, but coming at it from outside, it does look sort of peculiar. And I should also say that a lot of the content of Turkish Star Wars, and I continue to call it Turkish Star Wars because it is so much faster to say than Dünyayı
Yeah.
Kurtaran
Yes.
Adam or The
Yeah.
Man Who Saves the World. Um, but um, it was really created as sort of a mishmash of ideas out of Çetin İnanç and Cüneyt Arkin's minds. So there's a lot
Mm,
of philosophy and religious bits and pieces, probably some political bits and pieces that are thrown into this soup. Um,
mhm.
but if you're to say, well, it has this underlying sort of subversive political message, no. But to say it's devoid of philosophy or politics in any way, I mean, even even by being devoid of politics, I suppose you could say that that is making a political statement. So
Yes.
I don't want to invalidate that reading of it, but I think
Sure,
when it
sure.
comes to sort of artistic intent, um, it's just not there as prominently.
No, that makes sense. What do you love about this movie?
I don't think we have time. I mean, this is a movie that is relentlessly entertaining. From the first frame to the last, it is uh, fast paced, kinetic, loads of action, space battles, multiple alien races, monsters, robots, blasters, magic, sword fights. What is not to love? Not to mention the joy of recognizing bits and pieces from other films. I mean, it's just so much fun. If you're talking about particular scenes, I mean, none of my choices are going to surprise you. I love the opening dogfight sequence. I don't think I have ever seen so much footage from another source repurposed in such an audacious way. Not in terms of like brazen copyright infringement, because that really was not an issue, but totally reworked. It's something that I wouldn't really see until maybe a few years later. With are you familiar with the Space Mutiny? It was a Mystery Science
Yeah.
Theater 3000 sort of
Oh,
classic,
yes.
and that uses a bunch of footage from Battlestar Galactica. But even so, it's basically using it the same way that Battlestar Galactica used it, just changing the insert shots and calling the bad guy something else. And it's pretty much the same thing. But here you're looking at a sequence where they've totally cut it apart. And so now the TIE fighters are the good guys, the X Wings are the bad guys, the Millennium Falcon is maybe the villain ship. It's kind of unclear. Um, but it uses that footage to tell a totally different story. So that's loads of fun. I love the training montage with Marat and Ali punching rocks and kicking them until they explode. And of course, the big finale free for all with hundreds of alien monsters and Junit Arkin punching and kicking them with his golden gauntlets and boots.
Like, I was surprised this is the first time I've watched this movie, like, all the way through, and I was surprised, like, I just loved it in ways that, like, I wasn't expecting to. Like, obviously, there is, like first of all, it's, like, gleefully, creative in, like, a childlike way, but, like and so it's kind of in individual scenes, you're just kinda like, "W like, this is insane, what's going on here?" But I was surprised, like, at how well, like, like, a broad sense, like, how it's like, "Oh, this is, like, a satisfying story from, like, beginning to end." Like, it's kind of like if, like, there was a written essay and all the paragraphs were solid, like, these are all solid paragraphs, but, like, every sentence in them was just, like, an insane sentence. But, like, the whole structure worked. Yeah, it was just an insanely creative movie, and I think the editing kind of rises to, like, a level of, like, true art at some points.
It is
There
unorthodox.
yes, and there was, the one towards the beginning, it's after the Planet of the Apes sequence, when they're kinda discussing, like, "Do you think that's true?" And then there's that jarring cut that, like, the skeleton, army shows up and is immediately on top of them, like, fighting them, like, I thi you said this is like, the original cut was 2.5 hours, right?
Yes.
And they kinda do you think that the way that the final product was edited has resulted like that in particular, or
I would say that that is likely part of it, but I would not be surprised if that is only a small part. Inancha's films, especially in the 80s, were very wild and kinetic. He and his director of photography, who was also his brother-in-law, Chetin Gritop, they just did wild things with the camera that you are not supposed to do, and it's fantastic. Um, and there's a lot of sort of wild discontinuity of action or of editing that can make for a very disorienting experience. But I will tell you, having in a couple of cases really gone through this film frame by frame, certainly in the case of Turkish Star Wars, and not just because I'm a weirdo, that you start to finally realize, okay, so the action between these shots does have a logic behind it. It just doesn't come through because the shot shifted beyond 180 degrees, the angle rather, and now
right,
we jumped further away, and there was a weird cutaway. But like, if you were to write it down on paper, you could probably map it out as long as you were going slow enough. Now, I'm not saying that that is smart filmmaking, generally speaking, um, but it is something that I observed, and perhaps is maybe a treat if you've seen this movie enough as you start to be able to piece some of it together. I mean, not to mention the fact that some of the shots last just the tiniest fraction of a second.
Yes. But technically, it's like it's there though. It's like, I mean, it's not classical Hollywood editing, but like you can, it's there, just kind of like collapsed, I guess.
And I will say that, in many cases that is the case. There are also, elements of this movie that genuinely do not make sense. And like acknowledgedly
Yes.
they don't make sense. So I don't want to put this on an artistic pedestal where I'm suggesting you guys just don't understand, man.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. Though I will say, though, if you subscribe to the death of the author reading, where intention at a certain point doesn't really matter, and it sort of is what it is. So if you make those connections or you ascribe meaning to those things, I mean, that's certainly valid.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's more like a collection of art forms. Like you were saying, like even the use of like lifted footage is the way that it's used is, I think it kind of is its own form of found footage. Like they don't, it isn't just kind of slapped on there because they needed a shot of an explosion. I mean, it is that, but also they, they implement it in a way that kind of makes it their own, I feel like.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that.
Am I correct in understanding that you're in possession of the last known surviving 35 millimeter print of The Man Who Saves the World?
Yes, I am.
Um, how? Obviously, you don't have to get into
Giving away the
the
secrets.
y let me actually go back a little bit. What started your search, or was it something that you stumbled
No,
upon?
yeah, I think I should probably answer your question at how. So the problem with a lot of Turkish films and their existence is that so many of them from that period, it's the Yeşilçam was the street in Istanbul where most Turkish production companies had their offices, and it sort of became shorthand for the film industry between the 1950s and 80s, sort of Turkish Hollywood, basically. And many of those films were simply not preserved, or they were preserved improperly and there was a disaster. And so many of them have been lost or destroyed entirely. And often those that did survive, like Turkish Star Wars, only did so on videotape with the prints and negatives all gone. But in the fall of 2015, a brief ad appeared on an Istanbul cinema website for sale, 35 millimeter distribution print of The Man Who Saves the World. So it turns out that back in the 80s, a cinema projectionist had just kept it. Instead of sending it back to the studio, he claimed the print had been heavily damaged, way too damaged to ever play again. So the company said, fine, don't send it back, just throw it away. And he said, no problem, presumably with a great big wink. But in 2015, he sold the print to my colleague in Istanbul, Ali Murat Gürven. And Ali Murat had hopes of preserving, scanning, and restoring it. Unfortunately, no one in Turkey was interested in making that happen. I'd been following his efforts, and I eventually bought the print from him, knowing that there's much more interest in the film abroad, and that at least the scanning and preservation could be done here in the States. So I got the film and worked with a company to have it cleaned, scanned, and stored. Because by the time Ali Murat and I got a hold of it, this was not a pristine print. The color had faded and parts had simply been damaged over time and cut out, sometimes just a few frames, but there were about half a dozen really significant chunks that were missing, including the very beginning and very end. So when we premiered it in London in 2018, I produced a sort of reconstructed version with color correction and the missing portions patched from videotape sources. So that's the story of my involvement in the Turkish Star Wars print.
Well, on behalf of cinema files everywhere and fans of this film and the internet, I want to extend my hearty thanks and gratitude for your film preservation work. And then you did a very limited Blu-ray release of this restoration.
So So that was not
correct?
me. That was
Oh,
so
okay.
yeah, that was a company called Big Bosphorus out of somewhere in the western US, and they did a very very limited Blu-ray release.
I am one of the proud owners.
Oh my
I think it
goodness.
was what, one of 1,000?
Yeah, there were not very many. It was available for about a month.
I love that this exists, and I'm so glad that you made it possible,
Well, I
basically.
can't claim to have any particular philanthropic motives. I just wanted to see it. I mean, that's
I get it.
That's
No,
yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
that's not really true. I mean, obviously, like I love sharing these movies with people, and frankly, you know, when I got it, the goal was to get it in front of as many eyes as possible, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult. I mean, I reached out to lots of other labels, like, "Hey, I've got this thing. Are you interested?" And they're like, "Oh, that sounds awesome. No, thanks." So, I was really delighted that we were able to screen it in London. We're going to be doing it again next month in April
Oh,
for
wow.
a Remakesploitation festival that will feature that and four other Turkish remakes, in addition to a very excellent documentary by Jem Kaya called Remix Ripoff that sort of documents the history of the phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, is that from 2014?
That sounds about right.
In preparation for this episode, I think that came up in, my research. I didn't have an opportunity to actually get a hold of it, but,
It is very difficult to because of rights issues. So generally, the best way to see it is at film fests and so forth, which sucks. But he really, Jem Kaya, the filmmaker, he really wanted to get it out there, and it just didn't happen.
yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. Something that I wanted to say about The Man Who Saves the World, I actually really think a lot of the location work is really good. Like, the locations where they shot a lot of stuff, really adds a lot of, production value.
It does. It is gorgeous. So that was all shot in Cappadocia, and it's just one of the most beautiful places in the world. I want to go there. I've not been myself, but I'm not one to make pilgrimages to where they film movies and things. I don't need to see the house that Ferris Bueller lived in, but on its own, Cappadocia is just so cool. It's famous for those, I think they're called the fairy chimneys, those long sort of mushroom shaped rock formations, which you see when they land. Inanch and company filmed a lot at the Grima Open Air Museum, which is this complex of cave churches from the, I want to say, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, built into the volcanic rock, painted with religious iconography. It is just the most amazing. When they go and get that crazy lightning sword, that's all filmed there. Several other sequences are filmed there. They did a bunch of shooting at these very real underground cities. I think probably Kuyu is the one that they shot at. I'm not 100% sure, but these were actually multi-level underground cities built in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. And
Wow.
people lived in these like 8-story underground cities. When they go and they escape, they first meet the wise old man played by one of my favorite Turkish actors, Hussein Peda, and then the monsters attack and they have to run away from them, and they hide in this room and they roll this stone door to block the passageway so the monsters can't get them. That's real. That was an entrance to one of these actual underground cities. And in fact, some of the stuff that kind of sounds like nonsense when Ali Junaid Arkin's character and the daughter of the wise old man go and get the sword and the magical brain. And there's this narrator who talks about these pilgrims from a piece of earth, and they build these cities multiple stories underground and to escape persecution and stuff. Like this is based on actual history that has just sort of been transplanted to this science fiction scenario. There really were Christians who escaped into these underground cities to avoid persecution. I mean, it's super cool. And this like crazy volcanic rock complex is just one of the neatest things in the world to see. You can actually visit them. There are other cave structures from that area that you can go see. They built hotels in them that you can stay at, and I want to go so badly. Yeah, I mean, that whole area is absolutely gorgeous. And then there's a sequence that sort of comes out of nowhere at this mausoleum, the mausoleum of Haji Bektash Veli, who is, I want to say, either a saint or saint adjacent. And the wise old man is there and sort of talks about how Islam is really cool, and there were these followers of Islam who came to this bronze mountain that they melted down into a sword, and they're talking about all of this stuff um, at this mausoleum, and you're like, why is this here? And it's really because they were just near this actual mausoleum, and Anch was like, well, when are we going to be here again? Let's shoot something here, and so they did,
Yeah.
and it's a gorgeous structure as well.
Were the unused, spaceship sets were that would have been a completely different location?
Different
Like,
location,
visually
yes.
and yeah.
And that actually reminds me of something I believe you said in your deja vu on Turkish Star Trek.
Mhm.
You made the point that a lot of Turkish productions had, similar problems to a lot of American productions, which is a low budget. And here in the US, like we just had the backlot. If it's not on the backlot, we would shoot things in a soundstage. But in Turkey, they had, glorious locations and ruins and relics that they could just take a drive, and all of a sudden you have this incredible production value from these like real world, like you were saying, I believe one of the locations in the Turkish Star Trek production was shot at one of the seven
Yeah,
wonders of the ancient.
Ephesus, one of the yeah, site of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and that's the thing, it's like, Turkish Star Trek, it's, roughly a remake of the Man Trap, the first episode that aired, and on the one hand, their version of the Enterprise looks a little bit chintzier than the one that you see on the classic TV show, but if you look at the episode and you look at the Turkish film and you try to tell me that the planet that they land on looks better in Star Trek than it does in Turkish Star Trek, then you can go to hell because
Yeah,
that is amazing.
it's beautiful. It's I mean, yeah, the production value, I mean, the soundstage planet set doesn't hold a candle to what they were able to get on screen for Turkish Star
It's
Trek.
always the same, like 20 feet with the 6 rocks at the back and the
Yes,
colored
right.
cyclorama, right? Like, come on.
They just swap out the gels, and then
Hmm.
it's a whole different atmosphere, whole new planet.
And it's like you kind of have to do that because you want that control over the set so that you can shoot quickly, and you need to be able to get
Right.
good sound and so forth. And in Turkey, they didn't, like, there was no infrastructure, they didn't have sound stages, and they didn't have to worry about sound because they weren't shooting sound. They were doing the same thing that they were doing in Hong Kong or Italy. They were shooting
Right.
without sound and then dubbing the whole thing in post.
I was wondering if you know anything about, Janae Arkin's jacket that he wears in this, because it's a good one.
No, I want it so bad. Well, okay, specifically, I want the black one, the sort of uniform one that
Oh,
he
yeah, that one, yeah.
Ah,
yeah,
yeah.
with the logo on it. I want that one so bad, but, I know some people have recreated the blue one that he wears,
Oh,
for
nice.
like, either conventions or midnight screenings or things like that.
I was hoping it's his personal jacket.
Yeah, sadly, I do not think so. They also they recreated it for, the sequel to The Man Who Saves the World. They recreated both of those costumes, I think, but that movie's not very good.
Ananch's, idea for the unmade sequel, that sounded incredible.
Oh,
I
yeah,
wish that one was made.
yeah, so it was, yeah, it involved, like, the aliens coming and kidnapping the American and Turkish presidents. The heroes have to, like, go through a black hole and fight zombie ninja space warriors, and, the whole thing was another sort of even grander religious allegory about, a battle between good and evil and the devil.
Well, you said he's still around, yeah?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you think if we were able to crowdfund it, he'd be up for getting back in the old director's chair?
I don't know. I know that there was that some folks kind of wanted to do something not exactly along those lines. There was a project called like Dünyayı Kurtaran 1.5, and I kind of don't know the specifics of that, but that was a very short-lived kind of crowdfunding endeavor that was run by somebody else. It wasn't him, but he was on board for it. Yeah, I don't know if he would be interested in jumping in the director's seat, or if he's enjoying his quiet life of retirement at the moment. It's a really good question. I mean, obviously everything's kind of up in the air with, the whole plague and everything, but
Yes, right.
uh,
No, no, that's certainly true.
I did kind of want I really wished a number of years ago when the Expendables came out, I was like, "Oh man, there really needs to be a Turkish Expendables." Like, because there were a handful of really, really famous, or not as famous, but perhaps also like iconic Turkish action stars that would be really fun to like,
Wow.
put in a movie and shoot it on digital video, who cares? And just like, do it like the old days.
Yeah,
Because that's really the
Yeah.
problem in Turkey right now is that a lot of the old school filmmakers stopped doing it because getting budgets was really difficult, and only a few I think really made the jump to the sort of TV era, the shoot on video kind of era. And I'm not sure enough of them were able to embrace, and I don't mean this in terms of like they were reticent, but I think that there were barriers that meant that they just kind of couldn't embrace that new DIY uh,
yeah,
sort of video boom. And yeah, you still need some kind of infrastructure. You still, you're still, if it's very, very, very difficult to get the budgets, then, yes, you don't have to worry about paying for film and film development and so forth. But
sure.
you're still otherwise using similar resources, actors, crew.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's still hard to mount a
yeah,
production.
locations are probably more expensive than they ever were. So, there's stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you have any idea, or are you aware what Anak thinks of the sort of resurgence in the interest around this film?
He's very positive on it. I got the opportunity to sit down with him for quite a while when I visited Istanbul a few years ago. He is the sweetest guy in the world, and you know he's really positive on that this new appreciation for the film. I think he gets his hackles up a little bit when if you really harp on the fact that oh, they were stealing this footage or whatever, and it's like N
Yeah,
like,
yes.
n yeah, but no. Like, 1, there were no copyright laws that were really saying, "No, you absolutely cannot do this." He and all of his colleagues were working under really just terrible, miserable, insufficient conditions, and these films were transformations of Hollywood film ideas, but they were not, it's not just crude theft, and I think
Right.
that can kinda get to him, but otherwise, no, he gets a kick out of it.
I think didn't you say that he jokes that another was it Su did he do a Superman movie?
Yeah, no, it was
And he jo
it was, Kunt Tolgar, who was well, I would say maybe sort of supervising editor for Turkish Star Wars, but also, he ran the editing and dubbing studio where they, processed the film, and he was sort of the visual effects guy for it, and he was a filmmaker in his own right. Kunt Tolgar, he passed away just, a week or so ago, which is
Really?
extremely tragic. Yeah, I talked to him too. He was just a hoot to hang out with and talk about and talk with. Just so wonderful and funny. And he did joke about, that Turkish Star Wars has the reputation for being the worst film ever made. And he's like, no, it's not. It should be my film, The Turkish Superman. It's the worst film.
I'm very sorry to hear that he just passed
Yeah.
away. I didn't realize that. I believe you quote him in the book. He has that lovely quote.
If you can do it, do it. If you can't do it, steal it.
Exactly, exactly. Which I just love. I think that's great. Where would you direct somebody who was interested in watching Turkish Star Wars?
So, unfortunately, the Blu-ray was very short-lived, and if you go to YouTube, you're probably only going to get a very poor quality unsubtitled version from the current rights holders because they kind of have an iron grip on the stuff. And to be real clear, the company that owns the rights, Fanatic Film, they were not responsible for the film. This is run by a fellow who, in the I want to say mid to late 2000s, was just basically gobbling up film rights wherever he could get them,
Oh,
sometimes
yeah.
getting them for a song and then sort of ruling over them like Smaug from The Hobbit. Uh, so I've seen other people try to put up different versions of the film and they all get taken down. But I have heard that there are websites like archive.org and Rarelust where one might be able to procure such films.
He's heard. He doesn't
Yeah,
know. He's
I don't
heard.
know, but I've heard tell.
And now you heard.
Where can people find you and your work if they're interested in reading more about, what you do?
Sure. So the easiest place to go is my website, neonharbor.com. And that'll show you all of my projects, including my films and web series that have nothing to do with remakes. But you can find Deja Vu there. And if you're interested in my book, How the World Remade Hollywood, I would say the easiest thing is probably just to go to your favorite online bookseller because, at least in the States, most of them have it. Amazon and Target and Walmart and Barnes and Noble and everybody. Or you can go directly to McFarlane's website, the publisher, and that's mcfarlanebooks.com, and you can get it directly from them there. I understand that they're pretty quick about shipping those out.
Fantastic. And I will be sure to link to all that stuff in our show notes
Yeah.
for this episode. I really genuinely want to thank you for being so generous with your time and sitting down with us to talk about this film.
Let me tell
And
you
like I say,
let me tell you a secret. Uh,
go ahead.
one of the reasons that I do this ridiculous stuff, like uh, reconstruct the 35 millimeter print of Turkish Star Wars and write weird books about crazy remakes, is to have the opportunity to talk about films like this with other people that like them. So this is why I do it, just to chat about these movies. It's a great way to meet people, make friends, and talk about movies. So it is my pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, that is fantastic. It makes me so happy to hear.
I
So
just
go
want to
ahead.
personally recommend Ed's book because I'm like it's like my current happy place right now. It's like a treasure
Oh my
trove
gosh.
for anybody that like likes to learn new things about movies. Really can't recommend enough.
I had pre-ordered it, and I guess,
Oh my goodness.
my hard copy hasn't arrived yet, and so I was talking with Fry yesterday, and he was like, "I have it, it's out, the digital version." So I went online and I bought the digital version, and I was mad because I wanted to read as much of it as I could in preparation for this recording, but at the same time, I was enjoying it so much that I kinda wanted to take my time with it a little bit more, so that is to say, hearty recommendation, 2 thumbs up from this guy. And as well, we were saying off air, your Deja Vu series on your Neon Harbor YouTube channel is really fantastic. It's really great. It's a lot of fun. It's very educational. It's very fascinating, very well made and well put together. It's just I can't recommend it highly enough. I think
And you have
it's
other great
great.
series on there too. I liked Ninja the Mission
Oh my
Force.
goodness. Thank you very much. That was a lot of fun. Yeah, very sort of a spoof of the 80s Godfrey Ho ninja movies and other silliness where we stick ninjas into other
Oh, you know
movies.
what? I want to ask you. You directed an animated feature.
I did.
Yeah.
It's called Space Ninja, and it was based on a comic that a friend of mine started drawing, a web comic, and sort of before he could get anywhere with it, I was like, "This needs to be animated." And actually, in truth, it was. We did it as an animated series, a web series of short segments, and it sort of only got a season. And when we wanted to do a DVD of it, we're like, since these are so short, it just doesn't make sense to put them as like individual episodes because you're just gonna like watch them, then see a few seconds of credits, and then have to watch the next one. It's like, why don't we just edit them together in a feature? And since we're doing that, why don't we add some interstitial material and sort of enhance the finale and add some new stuff to the end to do some stuff that we might have done in future seasons, but to kind of wrap up the story. And so do it as a feature, and so we did, and that was a lot of fun. But if the pacing, if you happen to watch it and you're like, this pacing is weird, it's like, yeah, because it wasn't really designed to be a feature film. But
Oh, that's very cool. And is that available on your YouTube
It's on
channel as well,
Tubi.
or
it is
Oh, it's on
it's on
Tubi.
Tubi, and if you go to Neon Harbor, like there's a link to it.
Okay,
Yeah,
got
your
it, yeah.
website's very easy to navigate, I will say.
I just recently redesigned it to kind of be exactly that, and I'm really glad that it worked because I think yours is maybe the first feedback that I got on it. So thank you.
Nice.
So, knowing your enthusiasm for these kinds of discussions, we are planning to do a whole series of these. We definitely want to cover Star Crash and A Message from Space.
I got to tell you, you should reach out to Stephen Romano about Star Crash because
Yes.
he's the guy, and like everything I learned about Star Crash, I learned from his stuff. So uh, he's the real source. He
Well,
literally wrote a book on Star Crash that he was
yeah,
unable to get published. So
yeah.
so yeah.
Maybe we can have both of you on, but I think we're also going to do at some point Message from Space, which is
Nice.
another movie that I'm very fond of. So hope to have you back. Consider it a standing open invitation.
Thanks, and I do recommend if you're just, investigating other sort of Star Wars-esque remake exploitation films, the Italian film The Humanoid.
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
I haven't seen that one. It's on my list though of ones to
It's
see
so cool,
that
it's
we
like they
may
took all of
cover.
the production design from Star Wars and threw it in a blender. It's really uncanny. Highly recommended.
Well, that's a must watch then. Once again, Ed, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. If you enjoyed any of what you heard, please visit trashcompod.com and trashcompod on all social media, and we will see you on the next one.